They say if you see the woman in the black veil, you must never look into her eyes. Those who do are never the same again. Welcome to Dreamy Tales, where shadows whisper and the night holds its secrets. Sit back, relax, and immerse yourself in this chilling tale. The town of Ravenshade was known for its misty nights and the unsettling silence that crept through its narrow streets. It was the kind of place where whispers carried on the wind and shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. It was here that Eleanor Blackwood arrived, seeking solitude in the old manor that stood at the edge of town. The house had been abandoned for decades, its history tainted with rumors of a tragic past. Eleanor had inherited the manor from a distant relative she had never met. The locals spoke of strange occurrences within its walls, objects moving on their own, whispers in the dead of night, and a woman in a black veil who appeared in the mirrors. Dismissing the stories as mere folklore, Eleanor stepped into her new home, determined to make it her own. Dust coated the antique furniture, and cobwebs clung to the chandeliers. The air smelled of aged wood and something faintly metallic. As she wandered through the dimly lit corridors, she felt an odd sensation, a chill that wasn't just from the cold air. The house felt aware. That first night, as she lay in bed, the old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. A soft rustling sound echoed from the hallway, like the sweep of fabric against the wooden floor. Eleanor held her breath. Then, in the mirror across the room, she saw it, a fleeting glimpse of a woman, draped in a black veil, standing in the doorway. But when she turned to look, the doorway was empty. She told herself it was her imagination. The exhaustion of travel, combined with the eerie atmosphere, had played tricks on her mind. She turned off the lamp and closed her eyes. But just as sleep was about to claim her, she heard it. A whisper, barely audible, right beside her ear. "Leave while you still can." The next morning, Eleanor awoke with a lingering sense of unease. The whisper from the night before clung to her thoughts, but she convinced herself it had been a dream. The house was old, creaks and groans were to be expected. Still, as she walked through the halls in the daylight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Determined to settle in, she began cleaning the main rooms. Dust swirled in the air as she wiped down the grand wooden table in the dining hall. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, momentarily pushing away the eerie gloom. As she adjusted an old candelabra on the mantel, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. The mirror. She turned sharply, her pulse quickening. There was nothing but her own reflection staring back at her. But for a moment, just a fraction of a second, she could have sworn she saw someone else standing behind her. A shadowy figure shrouded in a black veil. Her hands trembled as she touched the surface of the mirror, half expecting it to ripple beneath her fingertips. It was solid, just glass. She exhaled sharply and turned away. She was letting the town's ghost stories get to her. That night, she decided to explore the library. The dusty shelves were filled with ancient books, their spines cracked with age. As she scanned the titles, one caught her attention: The Tragedy of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor's breath hitched. The book looked untouched, its cover pristine despite the dust surrounding it. She pulled it from the shelf, the pages brittle under her fingertips. Flipping through, she found an entry that made her stomach drop. Lady Evelyn Blackwood, betrayed by the man she loved, took her own life within these very walls. It is said that her restless spirit lingers, cursed to haunt any who dare claim this house as their own. A sudden chill wrapped around Eleanor, making her shiver. The candle beside her flickered violently, though there was no draught. She closed the book with a snap. The house felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. A floorboard creaked behind her. Heart pounding, she turned slowly. There, standing in the dim candlelight, was the woman in the black veil. Eleanor gasped, stumbling back against the desk. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It only watched, its presence suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Eleanor's breaths came in shallow gasps. She was no longer convinced that this was just superstition. Something was here. something that didn't want her in this house, and it was watching her every move. Eleanor barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every shifting shadow sent shivers through her. The vision of the woman in the black veil haunted her mind, her silent presence more terrifying than any scream. But Eleanor was not one to be easily scared away. At dawn, she decided to confront the house. If this entity wanted her gone, she needed to understand why. Armed with her notebook, a candle, and a determination bordering on desperation, she set out to explore the manor's deeper corridors. The air grew colder as she descended into the basement. The stone walls were damp, the scent of mildew thick in the air. Shelves lined with decayed books and rusted tools gave the place an eerie stillness, as if it had been untouched for centuries. At the far end of the room, a large, dust-covered mirror stood against the wall. It was cracked down the center. Eleanor hesitated. Mirrors had played too large a role in her experiences so far, but something about this one felt different. As she stepped closer, the candlelight reflected against its surface, illuminating faint markings along its frame. Words, carved in shaky, desperate letters. She is trapped. She must be freed. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candle. Eleanor gasped as darkness swallowed her vision. A whisper rose around her, stronger this time, urgent. "Help me." Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. She fumbled for a match, her fingers shaking. As she struck it, the small flame revealed the mirror once more. But this time, the veiled woman was not standing behind her. She was inside the glass, and she was reaching out. Eleanor's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The veiled woman's face was barely visible behind the cracked glass. Yet Eleanor could sense something in the darkness, an unbearable sorrow mixed with unrelenting rage. The reflection flickered as if the woman was struggling to remain visible, her hands pressed against the glass like a prisoner trapped behind an invisible barrier. Then, the whisper returned, this time clearer. "Set me free." Eleanor's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The voice was desperate, pleading. Yet there was something else beneath it, an edge of fear. What was she afraid of? Her fingers trembled as she reached toward the mirror, compelled by an inexplicable force. The air around her grew colder, and the scent of something ancient, dust, damp wood, decay, filled her nostrils. The second her fingertips touched the glass, a sharp jolt shot up her arm. She gasped and stumbled backward, clutching her wrist. The mirror rippled like disturbed water, and the veiled woman's reflection shuddered violently. The entire house groaned as if it, too, were alive. Dust fell from the wooden beams above, and the candlelight flickered erratically. Then, words began etching themselves onto the glass in jagged, uneven strokes. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she read them. "He won't let me go." The veiled woman turned her head toward Eleanor, her movements slow, unnatural. Though her face was obscured by the dark veil, Eleanor could feel her eyes, hollow, desperate, full of warnings. A sudden gust of icy wind rushed through the basement, extinguishing the candle in Eleanor's hand. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. The whispers started again, no longer just one voice but many, overlapping, echoing from the walls. Then a new sound, a heavy, deliberate footstep behind her. Eleanor's entire body froze. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as she forced herself to turn. A shadow formed on the stone wall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching unnaturally. Eleanor's breath hitched as the entity stepped forward, its figure obscured by darkness, but its presence crushing. The air felt thick, as if she were being suffocated by the very atmosphere. The thing towered over her, its silhouette blending with the shadows around it. A deep, guttural whisper slithered through the room. "She belongs to me." Eleanor stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the broken shards of the mirror. The veiled woman's reflection flickered wildly in the fractured glass, her hands now clawing at the surface. She was trying to escape, but something was pulling her back. The entity took another step forward. The entire room seemed to shrink, as if the walls were closing in. Eleanor could feel it now, a force so powerful, so consuming it threatened to pull her in as well. Panic surged through her veins. She couldn't stay here. She lunged for the staircase, her hands grasping at the wooden railing. But the moment she set foot on the first step, the house shook violently. A deep, resonating boom echoed through the space, rattling the walls. Then, the mirror exploded. Shards of glass shot through the air, narrowly missing Eleanor as she shielded her face. The veiled woman's scream tore through the silence, a sound so filled with pain and terror that it sent a chill straight to Eleanor's soul. She dared one last glance at the shattered mirror. The reflection was gone, but the entity was still there, and it was watching her. Eleanor barely had time to process what had happened before the air around her shifted. It was no longer just cold. It was suffocating, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. The whispering voices, once distant, grew louder. They no longer pleaded. They mocked her. She turned sharply, scanning the darkened basement. The candle she had carried lay extinguished on the floor, surrounded by shards of the shattered mirror. The veiled woman was gone, but the entity remained. A deep, resonant boom vibrated through the house, shaking the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the wooden beams groaned under an invisible weight. Eleanor's breath hitched as the presence in the room shifted. Something moved in the darkness. She couldn't see it clearly, only the suggestion of limbs, twisting unnaturally, merging with the shadows. But she could feel it, standing just beyond her reach, watching, waiting. The silence stretched unbearably before a new sound cut through it, a sharp, deliberate knock on the basement door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was calm, calculated, like someone waiting for her to answer. Eleanor swallowed hard, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refused to move. The entity in the shadows loomed closer, and then, in that same deep, guttural whisper, it spoke again. "You should not have come." The words slithered through the air, filling the space around her, inside her. Her hands clenched into fists. She forced herself to step back, to move toward the staircase. Escape was the only option. As she turned, the basement door swung open on its own. The hallway beyond was pitch black, no flickering candlelight, no signs of the house she had entered earlier, just darkness. Eleanor hesitated. Then a breath against her ear. Not a whisper this time, not a voice, just breathing. Something stood behind her. Panic took hold. She lunged for the stairs, her feet hitting the wooden steps hard as she scrambled upward. The air behind her grew heavier, like hands reaching for her ankles. The whispering returned, rising into a chaotic chorus of voices. Some screamed, others laughed. The door at the top of the stairs loomed ahead, open, the only exit. But as she reached it, it slammed shut. A force ripped through the house, shaking the very foundation. Eleanor slammed into the door, her palms slapping against the wood, trying to push it open. It wouldn't budge. A voice whispered from behind her, closer than ever, "You are not leaving." The moment the words were spoken, the entire basement plunged into unnatural silence. No voices, no movement, just a vast, empty stillness. Eleanor barely had time to react before something grabbed her wrist. A hand, ice cold with two long fingers, latched onto her arm and pulled. She screamed, thrashing against its grip, but the force was impossibly strong. Her vision blurred as her body was yanked backward, away from the door, into the waiting darkness. The last thing she saw before the shadows swallowed her whole was the shattered mirror on the floor, and in its reflection, the veiled woman watching. But this time her expression had changed. She wasn't pleading anymore. She looked afraid. The moment Eleanor was pulled into the darkness, everything changed. The air was heavier, thick, suffocating, as if she had stepped into a different realm entirely. The walls of the basement were gone. The staircase had vanished. There was no door, no escape, just endless blackness. The only thing she could see was the shattered mirror lying at her feet, its fractured pieces reflecting something that wasn't there. The whispering started again, But this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was inside her mind. "You don't belong here." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around her like invisible tendrils, crawling into her thoughts, pressing against the edges of her sanity. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up, to believe that this was some twisted nightmare. But when she opened them, the darkness had shifted, and it was looking back at her. A figure emerged, tall, grotesque, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't move like a person. It twitched, its body jerking in short, unnatural bursts, like something that didn't quite understand how to be human. And then it spoke. "She is mine." The words reverberated through the void, vibrating deep in Eleanor's bones. The veiled woman had told her she was trapped, but now, staring into the abyss, Eleanor realized the truth. She hadn't been trapped by the house. She had been trapped by him. The entity stepped forward, the darkness swirling around it like living shadows. Eleanor stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs. The mirror. Her gaze snapped to the broken glass at her feet. The veiled woman was still there, her face now fully visible. Terror filled her hollow eyes. She was pointing at something. Eleanor followed her gaze and froze. The entity's hand was reaching for her, its fingers, long, skeletal, shifting between shadow and flesh, stretched toward her chest. Eleanor screamed. She lunged for the mirror, grabbing the largest shard she could find. The second her fingers touched the glass, the air around her convulsed. A piercing shriek erupted from the void, shaking the very ground beneath her. The entity recoiled, its body flickering like a dying flame. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She raised the shard and slammed it into the darkness. The entire world shattered. A violent force threw her backward, her body hitting the cold stone floor of the basement. The darkness was gone. The door to the stairs was open. The house was silent again. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. She looked down. The mirror shard was still in her hand, but the reflection was empty. The veiled woman was gone. For the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor felt alone. But then, a whisper. "Run." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She staggered to her feet and bolted toward the stairs. As she reached the top, she dared one last glance behind her. The basement was still. The darkness had receded. But deep in the shadows, she saw it, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. And she knew. It wasn't over. Eleanor slammed the basement door shut, pressing her back against the cold wood. Her breath came in frantic gasps, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. The house was silent now, but the air still felt wrong, charged with something unseen, something waiting. Her trembling fingers fumbled for the key in the lock, twisting it with desperation. Click. The deadbolt slid into place. But even as she secured the door, she knew locks wouldn't stop it. She had to get out. Now staggering into the hallway, she clutched the mirror shard tightly, its sharp edge biting into her palm. Blood dripped onto the wooden floor. The house groaned softly, as if waking from a deep slumber. And then she heard it. Footsteps, not from behind the basement door, from upstairs. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The house had been empty, hadn't it? Slow, deliberate footsteps creaked across the wooden floor above her, pacing back and forth. She could almost picture them. Someone unseen, waiting for her to come closer. Then, the pacing stopped. A long, awful silence stretched through the house. Eleanor took a single hesitant step back. And then, the footsteps ran toward the stairs. She didn't think. She ran. Bolting down the hallway, she raced for the front door. The air thickened as she moved, as if the house itself was fighting to keep her inside. The walls groaned, the chandelier above swayed violently without cause, and the whispering returned. Dozens of voices, overlapping, clawing at her mind. She reached for the handle, but it twisted violently on its own. The door swung open before she could touch it. Beyond it, the outside world was waiting. The misty streets of Ravenshade stretched before her. The cold air outside rushed in like a breath of freedom, but Eleanor froze. Because standing just beyond the threshold was a figure. Not the veiled woman, not the entity from the basement. It was her, a perfect reflection of herself, standing in the doorway. Same face, same clothes, same expression of horror. But her other self wasn't moving. She was smiling. And then Eleanor realized the real Eleanor had never made it out. The house had already taken her, and now it was letting something else leave in her place. Eleanor's chest tightened as she locked eyes with her own smiling reflection standing in the doorway. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply stared back at her, the corners of its lips curling too widely, as if testing how far it could stretch the illusion of a human smile. This isn't real. Eleanor took a trembling step back. The floor beneath her creaked, but her other self didn't mimic the movement. It remained perfectly still, standing on the threshold, waiting. The house was toying with her. She could feel it now, pressing against her mind, twisting her perception. The whispering voices were no longer coming from the walls. They were inside her head. "It's time to go, Eleanor." The voice came from her own reflection. Eleanor's stomach lurched. The figure at the door raised a hand, her hand, beckoning her forward. But she wasn't a fool. She knew what would happen if she stepped through. Her real self, the one still trapped in the house, would cease to exist, and the thing wearing her face would take her place. Number Eleanor clenched the bloodied mirror shard in her palm, its sharp edges digging deeper into her skin. She needed to think, fast. The house wanted her to accept the lie, to step outside, to embrace the illusion, to fade into nothing. But she wasn't going to let it win. The veiled woman had tried to warn her. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to look past the false Eleanor blocking the exit. She focused on the street beyond. The fog, the dim light of the gas lamps, the distant houses. And then she saw it. Or rather, she didn't see it. No wind disturbed the fog. No leaves rustled in the trees. No sound of distant voices. No barking dogs. No chirping crickets. The world outside was perfectly still, because it wasn't real. It was a trap. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. If she had stepped through that door, she would have disappeared forever. She took another step back, and the smiling reflection twitched. Its expression flickered just for a second, like a glitch in reality. It wasn't human, and it knew that she knew. The moment she realized the truth, the thing wearing her face changed. Its head snapped sideways, bending at an unnatural angle. Its lips peeled back into a wider grin, revealing far too many teeth. The voice that came next wasn't hers anymore. It was something older, something hungry. "You should have left when you had the chance." Eleanor spun on her heels and ran. The front door slammed shut behind her with a deafening boom. The house was not done playing with her yet, and this time, it wasn't going to let her go so easily. Eleanor sprinted down the dim hallway, her pulse pounding in her ears. The house shifted around her, the walls seeming to stretch and breathe, warping reality itself. The front door had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor lined with mirrors. Her own reflections flickered in the glass as she passed, but they weren't moving like her. Some stared blankly ahead, others twitched unnaturally, distorting as though the glass was struggling to contain them. And then there were those that smiled, not in comfort, but in the way a predator smiles when it knows it has already won. This isn't real. This isn't real. She gripped the mirror shard tighter, its edges cutting deeper into her palm. If the house wanted to twist her mind, she had to fight back. Then, the whispers returned, not gentle, not pleading, taunting, laughing. Her own voice whispered from the mirrors. "You can't run from yourself, Eleanor." She skidded to a stop, her breath ragged. The corridor was endless, stretching far beyond what the manor's size should allow. The flickering candlelight above her barely pushed back the darkness creeping in from the edges. She turned, searching for another way out, and froze. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, tall, veiled, motionless. The woman in black. She had returned, but something was wrong. The veiled woman didn't move. She simply stood there, her head slightly tilted, her posture rigid, as if she too were caught in the house's grasp. And then Eleanor noticed something that sent pure dread through her veins. The woman wasn't casting a shadow. Her breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, but her body wouldn't obey. Then in the silence, a new sound emerged. A single, heavy footstep. Not from the veiled woman, from behind her. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see, and she wished she hadn't. The entity from the basement was there. It had crawled out of the darkness. It was closer than ever. Its limbs jerked unnaturally as it moved, its head too large, its fingers too long. Its eyes, hollow, endless voids, fixed on her. And then it did something worse than whisper. It smiled. Eleanor felt her sanity crack. The house had trapped her, and now it was going to make sure she never left. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps as the smiling entity took another jerking step forward. Its limbs moved like a marionette on tangled strings, its body shifting too slowly, too deliberately, as if savoring the moment. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The house had her now. The veiled woman still stood motionless at the other end of the hallway, her presence both a warning and a plea for help. But Eleanor had no idea how to free her, or if she even could. Then the entity spoke. Not in the whispers she had heard before, not in a voice that belonged to this world. It spoke in her own voice. Stay. The word was so simple, yet it held the weight of something ancient, unrelenting. The walls around her shuddered, the house groaning as if it were alive. The entity tilted its head, waiting. Eleanor knew what it wanted. If she surrendered, if she let go of her will to fight, the house would consume her, just like it had done to so many before her. Her gaze flickered back to the mirrors lining the hallway. Her reflections still stood frozen, some mimicking her expression of terror, others watching her with amusement. And then she saw it. One reflection wasn't standing still. One was moving, and it wasn't mimicking her. It was pointing. Eleanor's eyes followed the direction of the reflection's hand to the mirror shard in her own grasp. The mirrors. That was the key. The realization snapped her free from the entity's invisible hold. Her body moved on instinct as she raised the broken glass and slashed it across her palm, letting her blood spill onto the floor. The house reacted instantly. The walls shook violently, a deep, guttural scream echoing from all around her. The shadows convulsed, and the entity lurched backward, its hollow eyes finally showing something other than hunger. Fear. Eleanor knew now. The house had been feeding on her fear, on her hesitation. But blood was real, pain was real, and reality was the one thing the house couldn't manipulate. The veiled woman finally moved, stepping forward for the first time. And this time, Eleanor didn't run. Instead, she did something the house never expected. She charged straight at the entity. Eleanor lunged forward, gripping the mirror shard like a weapon. The entity recoiled, its twisted body jerking unnaturally, as if reality itself was trying to reject it. But Eleanor wasn't going to stop. The veiled woman was moving now, stepping closer, her black veil billowing despite the still air. Her presence no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a guide, a force pushing Eleanor forward instead of holding her back. The house screamed. The walls warped, mirrors cracked, and the entire corridor shook as if something massive was breaking apart. The house didn't want her to win. The entity lunged at her just as Eleanor thrust the mirror shard forward, aiming straight for its hollow, endless eyes. The moment the glass pierced its form, the house collapsed inward. The mirrors shattered all at once, and with them, the reflections that had taunted her ceased to exist. The veiled woman let out a final sorrowful sigh, her form fading like mist as the weight of the house's curse began to unravel. Eleanor's vision blurred as she felt herself being pulled away, out of the house, out of the nightmare. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her was the entity's terrible, distorted scream. And then, silence. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. She was outside. The cold night air hit her like a wave, sharp and real. The manor loomed behind her, its towering silhouette still swallowed in mist. But something was different now. The whispers were gone. The suffocating presence, the weight pressing against her chest, all of it had vanished. She turned to face the house, half expecting to see the entity still lurking in the shadows. But instead, she saw her reflection, not in glass, but standing in the doorway. It was the veiled woman, but this time, her veil had lifted. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she saw the woman's face for the first time, her own. Not twisted, not wrong, just sad. And then, like mist in the morning light, she faded away. Eleanor didn't understand everything that had happened, but she knew one thing for certain: the house had let her go, and whatever had been trapped inside it for so long was finally free. With one last glance at the decaying mansion, Eleanor turned away and never looked back.